As Ronell Wilson awaited his resentencing, he was held at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, a federal facility meant to be secure and impervious to the outside world. But inside its concrete walls, a new and scandalous chapter of his story was unfolding, one that would defy all logic and protocol. It involved a 29-year-old federal corrections officer named Nancy Gonzalez. A former U.S. Army member, Gonzalez was tasked with guarding some of the nation's most dangerous inmates. Yet she found herself drawn into a clandestine relationship with the very man who had murdered 2 police officers. What began with flirtatious notes and whispered conversations soon spiraled into a full-blown illicit affair. The relationship was a staggering breach of security and ethics. Gonzalez risked her career, her freedom, and her reputation for a man convicted of capital murder. She smuggled in contraband for him, and eventually their secret encounters became physical. The trysts took place in the shadows of the prison, in an activity room away from the most watchful eyes. It was a shocking betrayal of her duty, a line crossed that seemed incomprehensible to her colleagues and the public. Why would she do it? In later statements, Gonzalez would claim she was emotionally vulnerable at the time, and that she wanted to give Wilson something to live for, a sense of hope and a legacy. She saw a man, not a monster, but prosecutors would later paint a much more manipulative picture. They discovered letters Wilson had written from his cell, letters that suggested a colder, more calculated motive. In one chilling note, he wrote, "I just need a baby before these pigs try to take my life." The words implied a cynical scheme, that fathering a child could be a strategic move, a way to engender sympathy from a new jury and avoid the death penalty a second time. Was Nancy Gonzalez a lovesick, vulnerable woman who fell for a charismatic inmate, or was she a pawn in a convicted killer's desperate game to save his own life? The truth was likely a complicated mix of both, a toxic cocktail of manipulation and misguided affection. The affair continued in secret for months, a ticking time bomb in the heart of the federal prison system. Wilson, it would later be revealed, was not exclusively devoted to Gonzalez. He was reportedly making romantic calls to 3 other women from the prison phones, juggling relationships from behind bars. The man who was supposed to be isolated and awaiting judgment on his life had, as one judge would later furiously remark, turned the jail into his personal fiefdom. The scandal was about to break, and when it did, it would add an explosive and bizarre twist to a case already filled with tragedy and legal drama, leaving everyone to wonder how such a thing could have possibly happened. The secret affair between Ronell Wilson and Nancy Gonzalez could not stay hidden forever. The bombshell dropped when Gonzalez discovered she was pregnant. The father was, without a doubt, the infamous cop killer she was paid to guard. The news sent shockwaves through the Bureau of Prisons and the United States Attorney's Office. The security breach was not just a minor infraction, it was, honestly, a catastrophic failure that had resulted in the creation of a new life under the most sordid circumstances imaginable. An internal investigation was immediately launched, and the full scope of the forbidden romance came to light. The consequences for Nancy Gonzalez were, well, swift and severe. She was arrested and charged with sexual abuse of a person in custody. The scandal became a public spectacle. During Wilson's resentencing proceedings, the prosecution presented the affair as the ultimate evidence of his manipulative character and his utter contempt for rules and authority. They showed the jury a grainy surveillance video from July 15, 2012. It captured a 2-minute tryst between Wilson and Gonzalez in the prison's activity room, a stark and undeniable piece of evidence. The footage, though brief, spoke volumes. It cemented the prosecution's narrative that Wilson was incapable of rehabilitation, a man who could bend others to his will and corrupt the very system designed to contain him, even while facing a potential death sentence. In March 2013, Nancy Gonzalez gave birth to a baby boy. She named him Justus. The irony of the name was, not lost on anyone involved in the case. Here was a child, an innocent life brought into the world as a direct result of a relationship that was the antithesis of justice. Gonzalez, facing her own legal peril, pleaded guilty. She told the court she felt lost and that Wilson had given her a sense of purpose. Her defense tried to portray her as a victim of his manipulation, a broken person who made a terrible mistake. But the court saw her as an officer of the law who had committed a profound betrayal of public trust. She was ultimately sentenced to a year and a day in prison. The existence of the child, Justus, became a central and deeply uncomfortable element in Wilson's ongoing legal battle. His defense lawyers now had a new, powerful argument to make against the death penalty. Executing Wilson would mean making his son fatherless. It was the very scenario prosecutors believed Wilson had engineered. The affair and the resulting child added a layer of human complexity and moral ambiguity to the case that was both tragic and, honestly, deeply unsettling. A story that began with the murder of two fathers had now produced another child, one who would grow up in the shadow of his father's crimes and his mother's scandal. With the scandal of the affair now public knowledge, the stage was set for Ronell Wilson's second sentencing trial. Federal prosecutors, more determined than ever, once again argued for the death penalty. They presented Wilson to the new jury, not just as the man who had executed two police officers, but as a master manipulator who continued to show a brazen disregard for any form of authority. The affair with Nancy Gonzalez became a cornerstone of their case. They argued it was proof that life in prison was not a sufficient punishment for Wilson. He could corrupt, he could harm, he could even create life from behind bars. Only the ultimate penalty, they argued, could ensure he would never manipulate or harm anyone again. The courtroom atmosphere was electric with tension. Prosecutors paraded a series of witnesses who testified to Wilson's ongoing defiance. They brought up a 2006 incident where, during a prison visit, he had received a sex act from a girlfriend, while his own mother and sister were in the same room. This, combined with the evidence of his affair with Gonzalez and the romantic calls to other women, was used to construct a portrait of a man utterly devoid of shame or remorse. They wanted the jury to see a predator, someone who viewed every person and every situation as something to be exploited for his own gratification and strategic advantage, a man for whom rules were merely suggestions to be ignored. Wilson's defense team faced an uphill battle. They could not deny the facts of the affair or the other prison infractions. Instead, they tried to reframe the narrative. They argued that these actions, while wrong, were not the actions of a cold, calculating monster, but of a deeply flawed and impulsive human being. They presented the affair as a desperate search for human connection in the face of death. They argued that the existence of his son, Justus, was now a powerful mitigating factor. They asked the jury to consider the life of the child, to choose life for the father so that the son would not be orphaned by an act of the state. It was a plea for mercy, an appeal to the jury's humanity. But the defense had another, more powerful legal argument they were preparing to deploy. It was an argument that would shift the entire focus of the case away from Wilson's actions and toward the very nature of his mind. This strategy wasn't about seeking mercy or forgiveness from the jury. It was a direct legal challenge based on a landmark Supreme Court precedent. They would argue that Ronell Wilson was, by legal definition, intellectually disabled. And if they could prove that, then under the Constitution of the United States, he could not be executed, no matter how terrible his crimes. The battle for his life was about to enter a new and final phase. The legal argument that would ultimately decide Ronell Wilson's fate hinged on the Eighth Amendment's prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment. In 2002, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Atkins v. Virginia that executing individuals with intellectual disabilities was unconstitutional. This set a legal standard, but the definition of intellectual disability remained a subject of intense debate in courtrooms across the country. Wilson's lawyers contended that he met this definition. They began to build a case not around the events of the murder or the prison affair, but around Wilson's entire life, from his troubled childhood to his performance on standardized tests, arguing that he possessed significant cognitive limitations. The defense presented a battery of experts, psychologists and educational specialists, who testified about Wilson's low IQ scores, which consistently hovered around the threshold for intellectual disability. They detailed his poor academic record, his struggles with basic reasoning, and his inability to function at a level expected for his age. They painted a picture of a man who suffered from adaptive deficits, meaning he lacked the practical and social skills necessary to navigate daily life independently. They argued that these were not excuses for his crimes, but rather clinical facts that, under the law, made him ineligible for the death penalty. It was a complex and nuanced argument, a world away from the raw emotion of the crime itself. Prosecutors fought back fiercely against this claim. They portrayed the intellectual disability argument as a desperate, 11th-hour fabrication, a cynical ploy to escape the ultimate punishment. They called their own experts who challenged the validity of the defense's assessments. They pointed to Wilson's actions as evidence of his cunning and street smarts. How could a man with a supposed intellectual disability orchestrate a complex gun deal, execute a plan to murder 2 officers, and then manipulate a corrections officer into a sexual relationship. They argued his actions demonstrated a clear ability to plan, deceive, and achieve his goals, hallmarks of a functioning mind, not a disabled one. The debate raged in the courtroom, a battle of experts and interpretations. The jury and the judge were left to sift through conflicting testimony, IQ scores, and psychological jargon. The central question was profound. Was Ronell Wilson a cunning sociopath, or was he a man whose cognitive impairments left him unable to fully grasp the consequences of his actions? The legal landscape shifted again in 2014 when the Supreme Court in Hall v. Florida clarified its position. The court ruled that a strict IQ score cutoff was not enough. Courts must also consider adaptive functioning and the standard error of measurement in IQ tests. This decision gave more weight to the arguments being made by Wilson's defense and set the stage for the final ruling. The final decision on Ronell Wilson's eligibility for execution rested not with a jury, but with the judge who had presided over the case from the beginning, Federal Judge Nicholas G. Garofis. He had been the one to sentence Wilson to death in 2007. He had expressed visceral outrage at the security lapses that allowed the affair with Nancy Gonzalez to happen. Now, he was tasked with weighing all the evidence presented on Wilson's intellectual capacity and applying the latest Supreme Court precedents. The fate of Ronell Wilson, after years of trials, appeals, and scandals, came down to this single momentous ruling. The courtroom waited, the families waited, and the city waited. On March 15, 2016, Judge Garofis issued his decision. It was a thorough and meticulously reasoned 77-page opinion. In it, he permanently barred prosecutors from seeking the death penalty ever again. He ruled that Ronell Wilson was, in fact, intellectually disabled, and therefore constitutionally ineligible for execution. The judge acknowledged Wilson's IQ scores, but, following the guidance of Hall v. Florida, he placed significant emphasis on what he determined were Wilson's significant related and concurrent deficits in adaptive functioning. He cited Wilson's lifelong struggles with conceptual, social, and practical skills, concluding that these deficits were genuine and not a fabrication for the trial. Judge Garofis made it clear that his ruling was not an exoneration or an excuse for Wilson's horrific crimes. He wrote with palpable disgust about the murders of Detectives Nemerin and Andrews, calling them among the most cold-blooded and heinous in the city's long history. He did not downplay the severity of what Wilson had done, but, he explained, the Constitution places a limit on the state's power to punish, and that limit protects those with intellectual disabilities from the finality of a death sentence. His decision was a difficult application of law over emotion, a ruling bound by legal precedent rather than by public outrage or a desire for retribution. With the death penalty now permanently off the table, the only remaining sentence was life in prison, without the possibility of parole. For Ronell Wilson, the long legal battle for his life was finally over. He would spend the rest of his days behind the walls of a maximum security federal prison, likely the Supermax facility in Florence, Colorado, a place from which escape is virtually impossible, and human contact is severely limited. The finality of the sentence brought a close to one of the most tumultuous and high-profile capital cases in New York's recent history. The outcome, however, left many with a profound sense of unresolved conflict. The conclusion of the Ronell Wilson case left a complex and painful legacy in its wake. For the families of Detectives James Nemerin and Rodney Andrews, the final sentence of life in prison felt like a profound injustice. They had endured over a decade of legal proceedings, a trial, a death sentence, an appeal, a scandal, and a resentencing, only to see the man who murdered their loved ones spared the ultimate penalty on what many perceived as a technicality. Their grief was compounded by the frustration that the system they believed in had, in their eyes, failed to deliver true justice. Their loss remained the central, immovable tragedy of the entire saga. The case also sent ripples through the law enforcement community, serving as a stark reminder of the dangers of undercover work and the deep-seated animosity that can exist between the police and the communities they serve. The brazenness of the murders, followed by Wilson's ability to corrupt a federal officer from within a secure facility, created a sense of institutional vulnerability. It led to reviews of security protocols within the Bureau of Prisons and fueled a continuing debate about the effectiveness and security of the penal system. The name Ronell Wilson became synonymous not only with cop killing, but also with a shocking breach of the very order he had sought to defy. From a legal standpoint, the case became a significant precedent, particularly in the application of the death penalty in the modern era. It highlighted the immense difficulty of securing and upholding a capital sentence, especially in states without a history of recent executions. The successful appeal based on prosecutorial misconduct and the final ruling on intellectual disability underscored the rigorous constitutional safeguards that surround capital punishment. The case serves as a powerful case study in legal ethics, appellate procedure, and the evolving standards of what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment, influencing legal strategies in capital cases for years to come. Ultimately, the story of Ronell Wilson is a somber tale of crime and its far-reaching consequences. It's a story of lives lost, families shattered, and a justice system strained to its limits. It is a narrative filled with violence, scandal, and intricate legal maneuvering, leaving behind a child who will forever be tied to its infamy. The case closed not with a sense of triumphant justice or clear moral resolution, but with a quiet, somber acknowledgement of the profound and enduring pain inflicted one cold night on a Staten Island street, a pain that no court ruling could ever truly erase. The legal questions may have been answered, but the echoes of the tragedy remain.